Hey everyone, Tori here. We had an unfortunate sound error that we didn't catch until editing started. Holland's mic seems to have not recorded her side of the room, and her audio is only picked up by my mic. So I spent extra time adjusting levels throughout this episode to prevent a total re-recording from happening, but I need to apologize humbly for the echo and the lack of clean quality on that half of the audio. It was a total oversight, and I'll be more mindful and thorough moving forward. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to Lion and Mouse Commentary. I'm Tori and this is my best friend Holland. If you're new to our show, we rank various forms of entertainment by different categories out of a total score of 10, with only 2 points allotted for our personal taste. We break down everything as we go, so feel free to agree, disagree, or learn about something new. Just be sure to tread lightly. There can be hot takes and spoilers ahead. And we'll cut to the intro. Okay, so today I chose an album by the band Half Alive. I chose their first full album, which is titled Now Not Yet. This is familiar to both of us. We have actually seen Half Alive in concert together as well, which was very fun. But if this is a new album or band to you, this is some background. So let me pull that up. So it's the first full album by Half Alive. It was released August 9th, 2019 by RCA. There are 12 tracks. It's a total of 41 minutes. The band members at release were Josh Taylor, lead singer, Brett Kramer, drummer, and J. Tyler Johnson, bassist. So a little bit of info about this album I've got from Wikipedia. It says the songwriting process for this record began in 2015, which was before Half Alive was technically formed as a band. It was a challenge in which lead singer Josh Taylor was going to try to write 50 songs. And then the drummer Brett Kramer joined him on this project. And then after the band's formation and the release of their debut EP 3, which I think came out in like 2017, or 2018, bassist J. Tyler Johnson was added to the band, and from then the trio would rent a number of Airbnbs to write the songs off the album until 2019. And they would do that because reportedly they felt like they were more productive when they were away from familiar space, and so they would just rent Airbnbs all around and just go to that place for like a weekend and just like write songs together, which I found interesting. The album did peak on a few charts. So it hit number 33 on the US top album sales on Billboard, and it peaked on the Billboard US Heat Seekers albums, which I'm not entirely sure what that like classifies, but I found that interesting. And then it placed at number 15 on the Billboard's US top alternative albums. So, I think that's all of the important background. So, Holland, do you want to go ahead and kick us off?
Yeah, so our first category in music for albums is lyrics/writing, and a total possible score of 2. I give this 1.5 points out of 2. So, in general, I wrote down... I actually saw a discrepancy in the track listing. If you listen to it on Spotify, it says it is 41 minutes and 36 seconds, and it says the time very differently on the Wikipedia page by like a couple seconds.
Oh.
So, watch out. So,
don't want to be fact checked.
It's no big deal. But in general, I think lyrically, this album is done very well. I think that the songwriting in this song, kind of like the way I would kind of summarize the songwriting, is this feels very much like a songwriter's album, and that the songwriting is, I really appreciate it because the more you listen to the lyrics, the more you appreciate it. It has, most of the songs usually have a really simple hook that kind of grab you in, or something that's kind of quickly or easily identifiable, and then that kind of grabs you in to enjoy the song at face value, and then the more you listen to the song, the more you kind of can hear different complexities in maybe the verses, or certain aspects of the chorus, things like that. I think the lyrics and songwriting overall of this album are done really well. I think that it really hits some pretty good lyric tenets, I guess you could say, in the sense that a lot of the songs are really catchy. They have really interesting rhythm. It has kind of that appeal of like a pop song lyrically, but then there's a lot of depth to it where overall I would say that the lyrics are really poetic. And there's a lot of complexities and intricacies that I think are really good. I do like kind of the overall length of the songs. They're all pretty equal in how long they are. They don't really fatigue you as you're listening to them, or you feel like we've heard the same, 4 words of a chorus for way too long. There's enough to kind of keep you listening, keep you moving through the whole song. I think that in general, this is kind of some general statements. The song's opening track of Okay, I would say it's kind of an existential song, and I would say that kind of I know this kind of leads into our category of kind of album flow and cohesion, but it kind of sets you up for the kind of songs that you're about to listen to. It kind of has an existential feel to it, and overall there's a lot of depth and poetry to the lyrics that kind of give you the impression of this is kind of like a deep thinker's album. But I also like that the artists themselves and the lyrics of the songs, consistently across the board, they're very unashamed of their worldview. I think a lot of critics and I don't mean critics as in they were unwarrantedly critical, but just the music critics, when this album was out, did say that the band kind of quote unquote wears their religion on their sleeve. And I think it's very evident what kind of worldview they're coming from and what kind of thought process they're coming from. And I appreciate that it's not trying to pander or cover maybe a more Christian worldview to make it more appealing for mainstream audiences.
Sure, yeah.
And I think that aspect of the lyrics is that it further gives this mass appeal because it's taking a stand for something. And again, it's not super in your face. It's not like politically charged or even religiously charged, I would say. It's just like, hey, this is where we're coming from. This is our worldview. And I appreciate that.
It's just understanding, I think, the lens behind how and why the lyrics are written as they are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's kind of like we, in a previous season, kind of talked about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and it's very evident where C.S. Lewis, as an author, is coming from a very Christian perspective or biblical perspective, and yet that doesn't make you unable to appreciate the work of art. And I think this is very similar. They're coming from a very clear perspective and worldview, and I think it just further gives you reason to appreciate the artistry behind it. I think overall, there's a lot of songs that kind of acknowledge the struggle of life, but then also imparts hope at the end. So it's very much acknowledging like life is hard, things are tough, and yet the songs never feel overly depressing because towards the end of the song, they give you something to hope for, some kind of silver lining to see without it sounding cliche.
Yeah.
Some songs that kind of highlight that, I would say, I just noted the song Arrow, the song Runaway, and the song Maybe. They're very really acknowledging that life is hard, things are a struggle, but there is still hope at the end of the hard times. And then there are some songs that I feel like the themes of the lyrics are about kind of changing your perspective and finding maturity in a situation. So songs like Trust, Rest, and Ice Cold. It's kind of, sometimes when you're going through whatever life throws at you, you need to be the one to change your perspective. Like, you can't change your circumstances, but you should change your perspective and look at things differently. Like in Ice Cold, it says, you're caught up in the problems, stop complaining.
Right.
Tell me something beautiful. And it's like, sometimes, when life is hard, we want to complain about it, but sometimes we need somebody to say, hold on, like
pull your head up out of the ground.
Yeah, pull up, keep your chin up, let's look at something, while never sounding like, I feel like this is kind of a cliche term as well, but like, it never sounds like a Pollyanna moment. It's like, well, let's just talk about things that are great. It's like, no, like, we can acknowledge
that, like, sometimes it's not healthy to linger in the bad. Right. And then, and like the song Rest, where they're talking about, sometimes we need to take a step back from the busyness of life and just rest for a minute
And yet it's not saying that being busy is bad or that the things that cause you to be busy are harmful or dangerous.
But I think
sometimes that's just a natural part of life, but you also need to balance that with the concept of taking a breath and resting and changing your perspective or your actions to give yourself, the break that you need.
Specifically, I really like the line in Rest in the chorus. I think it's the chorus, or maybe it's like the pre-chorus or kind of like a hook, maybe. I don't know how you would describe it, but it says living busy isn't giving you your worth. And I think it's because I think that's a relatable thing. I mean, I feel like in my adult life, I feel like with every passing year, my schedule gets tighter and I feel like I have less room to breathe. And so knowing that, like, listening to that song kind of feels like, okay, like I am not necessarily like being irresponsible by freeing up my schedule enough to like rest and like take a breather and like make sure that I am, realigning like my heart and my mind and like recharging and things like that. And I think that it's just little lines like that I think kind of like feed the message well.
Right. And in line with that in the same song, it's saying rest is a season.
Right.
So it's not saying that you should just quit all of the things
exactly
you should do or quit all your responsibilities and like take a vacation.
Right.
Which I feel like there's time and place for songs that do have that message. Like, hold on, let's just, put it all on hold, put everything on hold and go take a vacation. I feel like that's warranted. There's times for that. But it's just acknowledging that, living busy isn't giving you your worth. This rest that you need is a season. Like, just take a season. Like, take a breather, and
because without rest, your productivity dies anyway.
Exactly. And so it's that kind of concept I feel like is really, really relatable. And at face value, it's really simple. But the way that it's lyrically presented to you as a listener, it allows for the nuances of what these concepts mean in practicality.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that instead of it just being like, I do enjoy some country music songs, but it's like, there are a few country music songs where like, let's, leave work now and go on a boat. Let's, leave work early, go on a boat, have some drinks and party and live it up. And I mean, that's relatable too. We all feel like that.
Yeah.
But this is more of like a mature, I already kind of used the term, but like a mature kind of thoughtful, deep thinker.
It's like practical application.
Yeah, but it's a little more like cerebral and heady of like how like somebody that wants to think maybe a little more philosophically would kind of have that look on life.
Sure, yeah.
Versus just a face value like I'm
party
tired.
it up.
Yeah, or like I'm tired, like sucks, like I need a break, I'm taking a break. So overall, those are kind of like general statements. I don't have a ton of like super, super specific examples about every, lyric for every song, because I feel like that would take way too long. I didn't give this full points though, because, before kind of other themes before I get into some negatives. I also think the song Creature, I like that I think it's a great song to end with. And again, this is kind of a little bit of album flow and cohesion, but it unpacks the complexity of the title of the album. And I really like that it, that we're in life in general, we're in this limbo of working on the now, but then also thinking of the not yet. Like we are right where we are in present day, but there's also this not yet of something that is to come. And I think Creature unpacks that in, like we kind of aforementioned, their kind of worldview. And so it's a very complex song, and it's something that I feel like most people wouldn't really write about, but it's this kind of dichotomy of the fact of being complete and incomplete, I think is a good kind of tension that I think a lot of people feel, but maybe don't have the words to identify. And so I like that lyrically, that's kind of the theme of the album, is this now, not yet. And so Creature kind of unpacks that complexity that I think a lot of people conceptually, maybe they can't put words to it, and this kind of puts words to it.
Yeah.
I didn't give this full points lyrically because I don't think it's a perfect album. I don't think lyrically it's, the most beautiful lyrics I've ever heard. I think it's very, very interesting. But I also do think some of the lyrics are really minimal in some of the songs. They're extremely condensed. This kind of will tie into not our next category, but a later category of production. I think that overall this album, so I'm going to say it now, and please just keep in mind, hold it in the back of your mind when I get to the topic of production if I don't recap it. But I think this album, musically, it also has some shining moments, and I think that there are some songs where lyrically and musically it's like this perfect synergy of the two. And then there are some songs where the musicality really shines and the lyrics take a back seat, and vice versa, where the lyrics really shine and musically it takes a back seat. And so because of that, it's not completely consistent in the lyrical category, and I don't think that's necessarily a negative, but because of that, this is not a lyric-heavy album for every single song. So there are some songs where the lyrically it's just really, really simple, very minimal. I know we kind of talked about the song Rest, but I think the song Rest and Trust lyrically are extremely similar. It's almost the exact same themes. Lyrically, neither are super, super complex, even though the concepts are really identifiable and relatable, and they're unpacked uniquely. But those two songs, and the fact that they titled both of them one-syllable words that sound really, Rest and Trust, both 2 of the 4 letters in their titles are, well, Trust is 5 letters, but, you know, they're very similar, and then conceptually they're also really, really similar. So I feel like you almost didn't need one or the other, and again, that's kind of album flow and cohesion. But lyrically, I think that it's not their shining moments of those songs. I think one is a little redundant compared to the other. And then also there is one track called The Notion, which is actually like a voice memo. It wasn't written by the band. It was just added into the album as kind of this interlude. And I think overall it leans more heavily into production, but it is a track, and there's only 12 tracks on this album, so 1 out of 12. It's a very short track. It's not really lyrically, even though it's technically, I guess, a song because it's a track, but it's not like somebody wrote that lyrically. The band didn't write it. I also don't think that the voice memo itself or that track itself really lends anything or adds anything, doesn't provide any kind of unique perspective or anything. Well, I guess technically it does kind of provide a unique perspective, but it doesn't really add to the album. I don't think there's anything lyrically like shining there. I can't really knock a ton of points off for it, but I do think there are some moments. The biggest reason I didn't give it full points was because there's this kind of back and forth between, are we focusing on music or are we focusing on lyrics? And so because of that, the songs that really, really shine production-wise or musically-wise, they're a little more lacking lyrically. So for that reason, I think those are mostly all the notes I have. But for that reason, I only gave it 1.5 points out of the 2 total points.
Okay. So for me, for lyrics and writing, out of 2 possible points, I also gave this 1.5 points. So I really echo a lot of what you say. So I don't want to like beat to death any of your points, but I do pretty much agree with the majority of what you said. I think the biggest thing about this album lyrically is that it has a sort of perspective. Almost every song, I would say, gives the context of some sort of like disturbance in life. And I don't mean that in any way other than like it's something like navigating change, confusion, feeling like a lack of identity, things like that. Like it's all, those are the contexts sort of given in every song. And yet they present those things with like unique vocabulary, catchy hooks, really cool like rhythm patterns, and like rhyming schemes are also really cool in a lot of these songs. And like you said, but underneath all of that, there is still the goal of finding peace, solace, hope, understanding for others in that same situation, that kind of thing. And so I really like this sort of juxtaposition of what could be really dark. I think if you framed the context that's given in all of these songs with a different underlying message, and this probably has to do with the band's worldview, but if you were to frame it in something completely different, this could be a really depressing album to listen to. and it's true that these are like all things that I think the majority of people go through. I mean, who doesn't feel tired when they're, overworked? Who doesn't feel, uncertain when like change is happening that they can't control or didn't expect or weren't prepared for? Like, these are all very universal situations that are kind of like written about. But I just really appreciate that it's always plated with like, but there's more than just this. And I think it lends itself to like a really nice, almost encouraging kind of feeling through the midst of like the hard stuff, which is fully acknowledged and really well explained and kind of alluded to with different sort of poetic meaning. And I think that like one line I really like is from the track Trust, and I would consider it like the essential line in that song, and it says, how sweet the taste of certainty. And it's like something that like is true, and we would acknowledge it when we hear it, but who has thought a thought like that, like how sweet the taste of certainty, especially when like everything around you seems to kind of be crumbling, and it's like if you can find one certain thing like and cling to that, I think that's just something that like we all crave in a moment like that. It's just that sweet taste of certainty. I think that rhythm patterns tend to give like a good feeling of momentum, and I think that I like seeing how the lyrics themselves are written and almost broken up. I think sometimes the lines can be kind of broken up in what would otherwise feel awkward, but because of the musicality, and this is probably kind of a little bit of a production note too, they they lend themselves to like follow the same momentum as the music. This doesn't always happen though. There is a little bit of inconsistency. For instance, the track Breakfast, I find that to be a very messy track. And it's one that I kind of skip, I would say about half the time, because I feel like the momentum of the lyrics does not really match what's happening with the music. And I'll talk more about that in production, but I just wanted to mention it here because it is a reason I didn't give it full points. I think that the big track from this album, the one that like I think is probably the most well known, it's had like over 80 million views on YouTube as of today when I'm recording this, is Still Feel. And I think it's a great song to sort of encapsulate the entire idea, I guess, of the album, which is that like, despite every like hardship, discouragement, lack of motivation, lack of confidence, like at the end of this, like there's still something in us that kind of craves to keep going. And so, I still feel alive. I think that's, but what's weird is like those feel like really like strong, like deep thoughts and feelings to like express. And it's kind of given to you in like this funky disco tune. And like it again, it's like, you have all of these like really important, well-written, deep lyrics, but they're presented to you in very palatable ways. It's like very easy to just kind of get lost in the music. I would say the first few times that I listened to this album, I really didn't absorb a lot of the lyrics. I just really liked the music, and it was very like, they have a very specific sound, and I'll talk about that later. But it wasn't until probably fifth or sixth time through the album that I really started like honing in and focusing on like, what are they talking about? What's the message that they're trying to deliver here? And sometimes when I do that with music, it kind of makes me change my opinion a little bit on the music. And in this case, I think it increased my appreciation tenfold for the songs, because I, as I'm understanding and actually like absorbing and processing the lyrics that I'm hearing, I'm like, you know what, that's a really good way to like express that. Kind of like you said, sometimes I think there are feelings that people have that are universal, but they just may not have like the vocabulary in their toolbox to like piece it together in a way that other people could understand it. And I think Half Alive does a really good job with that. The only other reason that I really didn't give it full points is because I do think the length of this album feels a little bit short because I'll talk about this again in album and cohesion, but kind of like you said, I think the notion sort of breaks the momentum lyrically. Again, I'm alluding to things I'll talk about later. But I think because of that, the pacing starts to feel kind of weird. And I think it's not perfect. Like you said, there are inconsistencies that I think are acknowledged. Now, I really like this album. It's still probably one of my most consistently listened to albums, and I've been listening to them for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years now. So I just think overall there are so many more positives than negatives, but I want to acknowledge that, like, I think there are a few things that are to be desired, I guess. So for those reasons, I gave it 1.5 out of 2 points.
Okay. Our next category is singing / vocal ability. So we have this a little bit separate. If you're new to our show, we haven't done an album in a while. So.
We only did one album last season. Yeah.
So I'm going to kind of explain a little bit here. So singing and vocal ability we keep separate. We have our following category will be production. But singing and vocal ability we leave separate because it's very common in music to have an artist or a band where maybe lyrically and musically they're not stellar, but the vocals is incredible, or vice versa. So we have them as kind of their own category, and that covers anybody that's singing in the band. So frontman, backing vocals, if it's a solo artist, etc. So out of a total possible score of 2, I give this 1 out of 2 points. So Josh Taylor does the vocals. He's kind of, I guess you could say he's one of the 2 founding members of the band. He's one of 3. I guess all 3 of them are songwriters, but he's kind of the spearheading songwriter of the band.
He's kind of like the face of the band, I guess. Yeah.
So, not that nobody else writes the music, but he's kind of the front man, if you will. I think his voice overall fits the music. I think that he enunciates the words really well. His tone sounds really good. It sounds like the kind of person you would expect singing these kinds of songs. Plus, I am always a proponent that if you are writing your own music, you get to sing it. That's just your right as a musician. I'm not writing the song, so I shouldn't get to say whether or not you should be the one singing it.
Sure.
So all props to that, but I think, honestly, he doesn't have the best voice. He's not super, he doesn't have this, incredibly, this incredibly distinct voice. He doesn't have this crazy range that's just, mind-blowing. This is not to knock him, but we did see him sing on tour. We saw Half Alive on tour. And I don't know if they had toured prior to us seeing them on tour. I'm not going to say what tour we saw them on or where we saw them or anything like that.
From what I understand, that was their first, I think they had just opened previously.
Okay, so they were an opening band.
Correct.
First headlining of their own tour.
I believe so, yes.
So, again, this is not to knock Josh Taylor if you're watching, which if you are, hi.
And hit us up. We would love to interview you.
But I recall in the concert, he did all of his own singing. He sang live, super mega props for him doing that. But I remember noticing towards the end of the show, you could tell his voice was going. Because he's new. He's new to this. And I mean, not all of us can be Taylor Swift and do a 4-hour show every night and maintain that vocal ability. So, again, I think that's kind of an inside scoop, but not really. I don't think he's you can't tell from his voice whether or not he was classically trained or had a lot of, I'm sure he's had coaching along the way and has put in a ton of work, obviously, to be healthy enough, keep his voice healthy enough to tour. So I'm sure he's put in the work. It's not to discredit his effort, but I think overall you can tell that he's not this incredible vocalist. And I think that's okay. That's not what he's about. He's about writing his own music in the band, being the frontman of a band and playing as a band member. So I think that just is reflected in this album, that he's not a vocalist, he's a songwriter and a band member, and he's the front man for the band, so obviously all of the vocals are kind of falling on him anyways. But if you compare him to other singers, he's not like the most incredible singer ever. Also on this album specifically, I can't tell if there are any, except with the exception of the song Ice Cold, which has, who is it? It features Kimbra, I think, in it. That's the only song that I can tell listening, and I'm not a musical producer, so don't take my word as gospel. But I can't tell any other vocalist that sings other than him.
On Rest, they feature Sam Henshaw.
That's right.
So there's two featured artists.
But other than that, I think Josh Taylor sings his own backing vocals. I
think the bassist also does as well. His name is Jay Tyler somebody. But it's just all backing, and I think he's got a voice timbre that's very similar to Josh Taylor, so it's just like blend. Just blend.
So because of that, also that's something that we kind of take into consideration in this category. The album overall does not have a lot of variety in the overall vocals. It sounds very, very tonal across the board. Whether it is or not, to me listening to it, it sounds like Josh Taylor singing lead, and then he's also singing his own backing vocals, which is not bad. Tons of bands do it. We've talked about that on this show before. But because of it, it doesn't give your ear a lot of variety to listen to. These featured artists have, very distinct voices. It does not sound like Josh Taylor singing. It sounds like their own artist singing, which is nice. But the song Rest, it really is more of like spoken word. It's not really a lot of vocals. So the Josh Taylor and Sam Henshaw don't really sound, I don't think it really highlights their singing ability. And then in Ice Cold, Kimbra doesn't sing a ton. She just really sings kind of the same refrain. So again, that's not really highlighted very well either. As far as giving you a variety to listen to. So because there's not a lot of change in tone, it's like there's not really a lot of like bass notes that you're hearing vocally, or like higher notes, or a female like voice vocalist singing, things like that. So overall it seems really, I keep using the word, but I can't think of any other description other than just like tonal. It all feels like the same kind of tone. It kind of hits your ear the same way. There's not a lot of songs. There's some songs where he does some nice like falsetto. He kind of changes his range a little bit in how he sings, but there's not any moment where you're like, oh my gosh, I couldn't hit that note, or, and he definitely doesn't ever sing, at least from what I can tell, I don't think there's ever a lot where he sings really below his own register. I think he just sings his like natural tone, and then he'll sing some falsetto, and that's about it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of all you're getting. But again, you can, if you write your music, you are allowed to sing whatever you want. And then also, I kind of chalk this, and I know I'm going to keep bringing up this track, but The Notion as well. I think it's extremely hard to distinguish what the heck is being said without reading the lyrics. And I think Breakfast as well. It's really hard to understand what is being sung without the lyrics. I know that technically could fall into production, but I think it's also the vocal ability of the words that you're trying to hear. And so I think that's kind of a detriment, because this is only a 12-track album. It's only, 40 minutes, 41, 42 minutes. So that's 2 out of 12 tracks. That's a pretty big chunk of your album. So those are the reasons I gave it half credit, because I do think that it's, it's not like by any means it's poorly sung or the artists are not singing well. He hits all the notes he's supposed to hit. He carries the tune the way he's supposed to carry the tune, but it's just not anything super, super stellar. So that's why I gave it half points.
Okay.
1 out of 2.
Okay. So for singing and vocal ability, I also gave it 1 out of 2 points. We're matching so far. I have to agree with you. And it is, again, not to in any way diminish the effort or even skill of Josh Taylor. He just is, who he is. But I think the nice thing about it is, even though he's not the best vocalist, and, I don't think he's going to make any top 10 vocalists of our generation lists on BuzzFeed or whatever, but
BuzzFeed?
I don't know. I'm just kidding, Sales. But I think that the nice thing about it is that you can tell how connected he is to his lyrics, because I do think he gives a level of like emotion and believability. He's very committed to what he's singing. And so I think that it doesn't necessarily replace the fact that like he's not the most stellar male vocalist I've ever heard, but I think it's something to give him credit for, because I think it does make a difference. In just like hearing it is like, you can tell that like these words are coming from a place of like personal like investment from him. So that aside, and that's really the biggest reason that I don't have full points. I'm actually starting with the negatives this time and moving on. The other negative thing is that Josh Taylor obviously wrote these songs, so he knows the lyrics backwards and forwards, but we don't. And if I have to pause and rewind to try to figure out what you're saying because maybe I don't have access to the lyrics at the moment, I think that's a bad thing. If your enunciation, or if you're trying to do something a little too fancy and you're losing the quality of like understanding what you're singing, I think that is a negative, unfortunately. And there are a few instances in this album where I'm like, what did he just say? It sounded like neat, maybe the melody was great or the rhythm or whatever, but like I'm not actually grasping the phrase or the sentence. So I have to go back. Okay. All right. Okay. After third time. Okay. I got it. But I shouldn't have to do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's kind of tough because when we were reviewing it for this podcast, like I'd already been really familiar with the album, but I also had the lyrics pulled up while I was listening to each song. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was like, oh yeah, that's obviously what they're saying because I'm reading it right in front of me. But now that you mention it, like you're totally right. The first time listening to this album, I was like, I don't know what they're saying. I mean, it sounds nice, but
right.
Yeah.
So, and I think with an album like this, where it is kind of singer-songwriter-y in feel, I think the lyrics do take a little bit extra weight than they would on like a typical bubblegum pop song, where the lyrics are just like the same 4 lines over and over and, whatever. So I think because the weight of importance is there, I think I should be able to understand what you're singing. And there are multiple times where it's difficult for that to happen. So those are the 2 reasons that I took off a point. But I think they do some very interesting things, even though I think, like you said, Josh Taylor is doing a majority of his background vocals, and maybe the bassist is as well. I'm not 100% sure. But what they did with a lot of the like vocal layering, harmonies, riffs, are really interesting, and fit the music well. So the first song on the album is Okay, Okay. And there's crazy like vocal layering that happens in the chorus, which is literally just like, I'm okay, or whatever it sings. And it's like, it almost feels like it starts, and then it's almost like the vocal layering makes it feel really wide and almost kind of like airy, like in a way. It's really interesting to hear they kind of repeat within itself, which is like strange, but it doesn't really feel messy. So I know that's probably part of production, but it's also like just the way the harmonies are layered are just really, really nice. Harmonies are also really, really layered in, but I think it's the song Maybe, perhaps Arrow. But they do like a really interesting like part. I can't even recall what my note is very vague to myself, so I apologize. But if I remember right, there is a part of those songs, or one of them, where they start, it's like one voice, and then it branches into harmonies, and then it like inverts, which sounds really weird to describe, but the harmonies almost like meet and then split differently, and it sounds really interesting in the ear. I'm a little annoyed at myself that I didn't write down that more specific. So sorry for my really vague note. The opening Oz and Pure Gold I think are also really nice. I think there are multiple voices in those Oz, because the one of the Oz sounds to my ear like there's a little bit of like I don't want to say this in a way that like makes it sound weird, but like there's like a vocal growl to one of the lower harmonies that's not typically present in Josh Taylor's vocals. So I think that it might be the 3 band members each taking an ah. But those are distinct in my ear. And they're harmonized really nice. I really like those. And then the riffs in the final chorus of Still Feel. I know that like we just talked about the fact like we both agree that like Josh Taylor is not an amazing vocalist, but I think of all the songs on the album, Still Feel is probably his best vocally, and I still sometimes get goosebumps when I listen to the final chorus. I love the way he diverts off of that melody. I love all the like crazy riffs that he kind of layers over top of everything. It's just really satisfying. It makes this song feel so full and so grand, and it also like, I don't know, it feels like a little bit of an adrenaline rush toward the end, and it just feels really, really good to listen to. I think Sam Henshaw's voice is wonderful, and I have never heard this man ever before or since. I haven't looked at any of his like actual music. I don't know who Sam Henshaw is, but I think they did a great job putting him on Rest. I like his voice a lot in Rest, and I think it adds a really, really interesting color to the album, and it comes very late in the album, and I think having Ice Cold with Kimbra and then Rest with Sam Henshaw, I know this is again cohesion, but their voices is what I'm specifically talking about. We get the nice vocal colors right at the part where we could have been getting really, really tired at this point in the album. So I think just like, I really like Sam Henshaw's voice. I want to hear him sing more. I keep meaning to like kind of look him up and like see what other stuff he's done, because I think his voice is really lovely.
So Sam, if you're listening,
hit me up. I want to hear more about your music. Maybe I'll actually like dive into your discography if you like want to get interviewed, because we'll do it. But I think his voice is really, really lovely, and I think it adds a lot to Rest. I wish he was in more of the song, because I think he just kind of gets like a verse and like a pre-chorus. But I'll kind of wrap up here. But 1 out of 2 points for me for singing and vocal ability.
Cool. Okay, so our next category is production. So out of a total possible score of 2, I gave this 1.5 points out of 2. So, kind of to recap, because I remembered to recap, I do think this album has these songs that perfectly blend lyrics and music. And then there are some songs where the lyrics are really good and the music's just kind of, you know, not really shining, and where the songs where the music's really good and the lyrics just aren't quite as good. So for that reason, I couldn't give it full points, because I don't think every single song is just the best musical composition or production value that you can have. But I do have quite a few highlights. I think, kind of like you mentioned earlier, I think the song Still Feel really is like the shining track of the album. I think it was really smart for them to release. I think it was their first single.
Yes, it was the first one released, yeah.
It's probably their most well-known song, and I think there's reason behind that. There's so many complexities in that song musically, and it's extremely catchy, and the overall musical feel of the song builds with the lyrics, and I really, really like that. So there's a lot of variety to that song lyrically. It has kind of this pop jazz kind of feel to it, and then the way that the lyrics are extremely emotive, that musically kind of fills out and follows what the lyrics are kind of singing about. And I think that's just kind of the shining song of the album. And I think it's just a really good picture of how this album has those songs that do balance that lyric and the strength of the lyrics and the music together. Just initially listening to this song, I think the song, Okay. If you're listening to it in headphones, you can hear the left and right audio change. I really like that in songs. It's something you would miss if you're just listening to it on a speaker or maybe even in the car. And then I really like the use of brass and horns in that song. Overall, I think, in this song really draws a lot of inspiration from jazz music and jazz sounds, and I like that in music, and it's something that's not done commonly. Well, I shouldn't say that. I don't think that's exactly accurate, but I feel like a lot of times songs, especially maybe more modern songs from pop, like forward songs, it's like they use jazz or horned instruments as kind of like a gimmick. It's like, oh, we'll bring in
this is our jazzy tune.
Right, or no, it's like more like, okay, now we're gonna sing this whole song and then throw the horns in at the end. Or like when, some songs will like throw in the choir at the end, like just throw it at the end and we don't know how to end the song, let's end it with the choir.
Yeah.
Or let's end it with the jazz solo, and so it's just more like a gimmick, but this song, it really feels like it was intentionally incorporated into the writing and production of the song from the beginning. It wasn't just like a halfway thought out plan that they just kind of like, well, we don't know what to do, let's just make some jazz in there. I also really like that they use auto-tune very creatively. It's used for effect. It's not used to carry the song, but there are moments where some of the vocals will be auto-tuned just for emphasis more than for specific, like being auto-tuned through the entire song. It's not super overwhelming. The song maybe especially, I think, has a lot of jazz influence to it, and it's not just jazz as in like, oh, they have a saxophone or a trumpet, but I think rhythmically there's a lot that is done in more of a jazz feel. There's a lot of syncopation in okay, there's a lot of like the vocals and the percussion are kind of syncopated with each other, and then some songs they're like syncopated opposing each other, so then they kind of get this harmony with the two of them together. I don't mean harmony as in like
but like a harmonious musicality.
Yeah. Exactly. I really like just kind of a soft spot for me because the drummer Brett Kramer is one of the co-founders of the band, and he's one of the three like band members. I really like that you can tell that the drums were given thought and attention. Mm-hmm. They weren't given an afterthought. And I'm not going to compare this. It's not comparing apples to apples completely, but it is similar to how a band like Paramore, which we've talked about in our past seasons, how Zach Farrow is a member of the band. He's not just a drummer that was hired to write songs.
Yeah.
And so he intentionally wrote drum beats and rhythms to fit the song, and the same thing is true on this album. I think you can really, really tell that there are moments where it feels like, and I wasn't there when they wrote it, so I couldn't say, but it feels like the drums were written first and then the vocals were written after to accompany the drums, versus the way a lot of songs I think are written is we're going to write the lyrics, I'm going to write the lyrics with my guitar, my piano, and then you make the drums fit the music.
Right.
And so this album, I think, does a great job of, you can almost tell that the drums were written first and then everything was written to follow or fit that.
It makes me think of learning for the process of this podcast episode, knowing that they were like, we want to try to write 50 songs. Let's go to an Airbnb for a weekend and just do nothing but write music. It lends itself to me to it would be very easy for me to believe that they're just like on instruments, creating beats and spitting out lyrics and throwing a guitar riff over this and a piano melody over that. And I think it feels organic in that way. So. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, another song where I feel like is a good balance, kind of like Still Feel. Pure Gold, I think, highlights the music and the instrumentation just as much as the lyrics and the vocals. It's really music heavy or music forward versus just being lyrical with, your production kind of done after the fact. I do think, though, that the production of this album overall is not perfect. again, I kind of already mentioned Rest and Trust, I think lyrically are really similar. I also think musically they're very, very similar. Those two songs really sound very, like, samey, for lack of better terms. And I don't think that's necessarily, like, you know, I mean, you can like both of them. I don't think there's any, problem with that. But I think just as an album as a whole, I feel like one of them kind of feels a little unnecessary. I think that, musically both are really, really stripped down. There's not a lot of musical variety or a lot of stuff that kind of engages you. There's nothing that really surprises you in those songs. It just feels very, very stripped down. More so it's like, I think Rest especially, there is melody, but I feel like a lot of that song, well, Rest and Trust both, there's a lot of those two songs where it really just feels like I'm reading a poem to a backing track of a beat versus I'm singing a song or I'm giving you. And again, that's an artistic choice. That's a stylistic choice, but I don't think it highlights, the production of an album. I mean, it sounds almost like just a drum track and then I'm reading you my slam poetry over the bongos, so, which it's not... Yeah, I mean, it's not a negative thing. It's not a bad thing, but I feel like it is just a moment where it's like, okay, the focus of the song is the lyrics. We're focusing on the words here. Like, that's what's supposed to impact you. The production is supposed to be like this kind of stripped down, minimal, almost non-existent, like, music. Also, I think the song Breakfast, I really don't like it. I think musically it's extremely hard to follow. There's not really a tune that you can like grab onto. There's not a melody that's kind of like woven through there that your ear can latch onto and you can follow it. It's just this very like ethereal choral sounding like oohs and ahs, and then there's this almost non-melodic lyrics woven in through there. It's really hard to decipher. I think production wise, to me at least, it sounds like everything is just kind of, it's like it's all, I can really describe it. It's like if you take watercolors and you like mix all the colors together, it just kind of all bleeds into this one shade.
Yeah.
It's kind of what that song sounds like. It's just like you have all these components, but we've watered it down so much that it's all kind of bled into each other. It's just all, until it's all blurred and we can't really hear or grasp any kind of, melody or process. It does kind of echo Pure Gold. The chorus, like the melody of the chorus is like a really slowed down of the opening kind of ahs of Pure Gold. So there's kind of this like symmetry, if you will, and I understand that concept, but if you're not reading the lyrics, I feel like you can't understand what's even really being said. Also, I don't think this is necessarily a negative or a positive, but the outro at the end of Creature is so long. Like, it's extremely long, like, outro of the song. I don't think that's necessarily negative, but it's kind of like, I think the momentum of that song really does kind of wind down and end really abruptly. It doesn't have, I wouldn't say it doesn't have a good ending, but it doesn't really have an aesthetically appealing ending, if that's the best way to put it. I don't think it sounds terrible, but it doesn't really end in a way that gives your ear a nice resolution, like a nice, it almost, if you were playing a note, it almost ends on like a dissonant note. Or
without
like
the resolution.
Without that resolution at the
Yeah.
end of it to kind of give you that nice concept of finality, that this is the end of the album. And again, I can agree that can be an artistic choice, that's your stylistic choice, and that's fine, but I think it's kind of a detriment to your listener, because usually when I listen to the song, by the time they get to kind of that last long outro chorus, I wouldn't even call it a chorus, but it's like that long last paragraph that is really just kind of, there's not really a melody to the lyrics, it's really just kind of spoken in rhythm. I mean, by the time you get to that point, you could end the song right before it, and that would give your ear a better resolution than the way that the song intentionally ends. So again, I if you enjoy it and you like it, and if you're an artist and that's the way you want your song to end, by all means, you have that right to do so. I'm not in any way trying to discredit it as an artistic choice, but I think objectively it leaves something to be desired. And so those are most of the reasons. I'm just looking over my notes again. But I do think that there's a nice variety of instruments. There's a variety of music. I think that overall, the music of this album really does shine. But I just couldn't give it full points for production. So 1.5 points out of 2.
Okay. So for me, for production out of 2 points, I gave it 1.5 points. We really are matching.
Yep.
I agree with a lot of what you said. I have a slightly different perspective on a couple of things, but for the most part, I think, I share sentiments. So I think that overall, musically, this album gives you a very nice idea of the overall sound of the band Half Alive. They have a pretty distinct, I would say, sound or color to their music that's not commonly found, I think, or at least I'm not privy to a lot of bands that sound like this, and I think that that's a good thing, and I think that they know what they're good at and they're good at what they do, so I commend them for that. But there are some negatives. I will talk about those, I think, kind of later. For the most part, I would describe their musicality as an electronic bass, not BASS, but BASE. There's like an electronic bass to most of their songs. I don't think that's a bad thing, by the way. We've talked about Owl City. He's primarily electronic music. We do not dislike electronic music. I think, and pardon me if I'm speaking for you incorrectly, but I think that we both would acknowledge that to be musicality and music production. It's just a different medium than picking up an instrument. But with Half Alive, you have the electronic bass, but then those are layered with actual instruments that the band members play. And I think that each piece is very carefully crafted and layered to complement the other pieces. And I think they do that for the most part really well, but not always. I like the layering guitars. I like the layering brass. I like that the drums are distinct on almost every track. And that the overall percussion rhythms it's not the same 1 2 3 4 or 2 4 or whatever, it's not the same thing every track, and I like that. But the overall sound still feels like I'm listening to a Half Alive song. There's nothing that's like, oh, this sounds like a Fall Out Boy song. Like, there's nothing like that. I think if you were looking for an album that is so diverse, this is not the album for you. It can be a negative in the fact that sometimes I think the repetition can be noticeable. But so if you have an aversion to hearing the same kind of vibe, I guess, for lack of better term, for 41 minutes, then this is probably not the album for you. But for somebody like me, I don't mind a cohesive sound, as long as it doesn't feel too samey. And I think that that's a fine line to kind of balance on. And I think for the most part, Half Alive does that really well. The bass line is really, really nice, especially in the track Trust. I know you said that that's kind of a song that feels kind of samey to you when comparing to Rest, and I don't disagree, but I do think that one thing that makes Trust stand out apart from Rest is that the bass is so heavily featured in Trust, and I really like it. So I think if I were to pick personally, I know for the categories we try to be kind of objective, but if I had to pick a personal pick for the most interesting song musically on the album, it's going to be Arrow. I thought about this. I actually battled between 2 tracks, and I think that it's Arrow And I think not only is it the most interesting musically, it's also one of the most pleasing overall to listen to the ear. It follows the same sort of like familiar cadence and pattern that like you would expect from a song by the time you get to Arrow that like kind of sounds like the band. But I think each section of the song and like verse to chorus to verse to chorus to bridge to chorus is all distinct. And not only does the vocal intonation change or emotion change enough that it feels interesting, but also the musicality changes in each section. And so I think it may not be necessarily the most experimental song on their album, but I think it is the most interesting for my personal pick. You guys can think differently. Yeah, that's okay. I also think it's one of the most memorable songs just musically. Like if I were to take the lyrics out, I think it's maybe one of the most memorable songs, that and then Still Feel, which I think, we've talked about I think it's iconic. Their iconic song for a reason, and I think it's earned that place. The other song that I was going to mention potentially as being the most interesting is Creature, which is the song that you just mentioned having a very long outro, and I agree. I think they could have solved that by doing what is not very popular right now in music, but a fade out. And I think they could have solved that issue, but I do enjoy the change between the song and then the outro, which feels almost like its own thing. It could be like a different track almost, but the way that they transition that, and I've tried to figure this out before, and Holland can attest to this. They don't necessarily change the tempo or the time signature, but it's like they do this staccato syncopation thing so that the downbeat suddenly falls on like the wrong beat, and it makes it sound so almost like, I don't want to say crazy. It doesn't make it sound crazy, but it's almost dissonant in a way. And there has to be some sort of like artistic reason for that. I don't know what that is. I don't think it's bad, but it is incredibly interesting. And I remember the first time hearing that song and being like, oh, I really like this. And then like, I'm like, okay, what's happening? We're changing. Suddenly this doesn't feel like the same thing anymore. It's a lot of like, and they do a lot of weird like vocal effects. There's a lot of weird reverb and like stuff like that. And it just gets really, really interesting by the end. I do agree that it goes on a little too long. So I think that, like I said, I think the solution for that may have been like a fade out. And then, but I don't know. I know that fade outs are not really a popular thing anymore. That was very big in the 80s and not so much anymore.
I feel like they could have just shortened it.
That's true.
I just feel like it's just a little too long. Like after the lyrics of the song end, like musically, it continues for like a good 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think it's like 40 or 45 seconds.
It's a long time. I just think
and then there's another tagged voice note at the end.
Right.
Which, fun fact. I think the biggest issue I have with the production, and I know you talked about this, is the song Breakfast. I think it's the messiest song on the album, musically, and production-wise. And I think it is cool what they were going for, which I think is a tie back and allusion to Breakfast is the next to last song on the album. So in a way, this is headcanon, okay? This is not confirmed. But it kind of feels like what they were going for is let's call back and recollect everything we've gone through to get to this part. And so it feels like they're almost sampling sections from, like, there's a little bit of the brass from Trust, I think, that gets in there. There's the Oz from Pure Gold that you mentioned.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Did I say it was from Pure Gold? I may have misspoke, so sorry if I
No, you did. You said the Oz were from Pure Gold.
Yeah, it was Pure
Yeah.
Gold.
So the Oz are from Pure Gold. I'm pretty sure that they sample some of the bass from Trust. I also think some of it's slowed down, but I think the shaker that's in the beginning of Runaway is also present somewhere in Breakfast. So I get the idea. I acknowledge that the idea is neat. However, I think in execution, it just got so messy and it's very hard to distinguish. And not only that, all of the cool attempts of like, you know, almost like recapping the album are lost in the insane amount of reverb that they put on everything. And so what it feels like when you're listening to Breakfast is like, it's like an audible version of driving through fog at night. And it's like, maybe you're driving through your neighborhood. It's familiar territory, but it all feels a little bit wrong. And so that's the best way that I can really describe Breakfast, is it's kind of like an audible representation of that. And I think that some of the lyrics that are written just for Breakfast, like I think there's a line that says, here's a safe place to lay your heart down. That's a beautiful sentiment, and I don't want to discount the writing in it. I just think that all of the good things about Breakfast are lost with how they arranged and presented it to you. And honestly, if Breakfast was not on the album, I'd probably give this section a full 2 out of 2 points. But I think it's such a stark, what am I listening to moment? And not in like a way where you're like, oh, whoa, I didn't expect this. You know, like that's an interesting thing, but almost like this just doesn't feel the same. Like it doesn't feel, I don't know how to even describe it. But hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say. I just think it's so lost. It's so messy. And that unfortunately it feels like they tried to be too experimental with this track and it ended up backfiring. And it's
like it's trying, it's almost like it's trying too hard to be artsy.
Right. And so I think it's losing its impact under all of the like art layers that they tried to throw in. So, all of that to say, 1.5 points out of 2 for production for me as well.
All right. So next category, which is unique to our albums. Well, all of these are technically unique based on whatever we're reviewing, but we designate a specific category to album flow and cohesion. So it's always a total possible score of 1. Because I think that there's a lot of times where you might have a really great album and like all the songs are great and all the lyrics are perfect and it's all great, but it just doesn't feel like it belongs. All those songs belong together. So we'd like to give this its own score. So out of a total possible score of 1, I give this 0.5 point out of 1. If you give this 0.5 point, that's going to be pretty funny. So I'm predicting right now that Tori also gave this 0.5 point out of 1.
Keep going.
Yeah, so some things we kind of cover like in this category is if there's a lot of consistency, if there's a lot of redundancy, if there's an overall theme to the album, because not every artist picks a theme for their album, but some artists are really specific about that. And then we also leave this as an opportunity to discuss any specifics about the title, the cover art, the way the album looks, things like that. So kind of like your packaging of the album and how that's given to you as a listener. So I kind of touched on this a little bit at the beginning, like with the lyrics that the title of the album is Now Not Yet, and I think that is a great title for this album, and I think the band as a whole does a great job of picking songs that reflect the theme, if you will, of the album, which is this Now Not Yet, this kind of we are complete, yet we're still incomplete. We're in a good place, but yet there's someplace better we'd like to be, or we are content but yet still yearning for something better, or we're restless but we know something better is coming. So this kind of theme of this now not yet is really reflected well in the album overall. I think it's a great theme to have for an album. It's really interesting. In Trust, they actually mentioned we're in the now and not yet, so that I kind of like, it's like when you watch a movie and then the person says the line that's the title of the movie, it's very much like a blink and you will miss it. Like you'll completely miss it. I didn't catch it till we were reviewing this album for this podcast, and I was literally reading the lyrics and I was like, oh,
There it is.
That's the title theme.
Yeah.
Because there's no title track for this album, which I don't think is necessarily a good or a bad thing with albums in general. I just like when they kind of tell you why is this album called what it is. A lot of artists don't actually have a title track for their album. I think the concept overall is really unpacked well in their final song of the album, Creature. I think that kind of is a great... I guess I would say, yeah, I think it's a pretty detailed unpacking of what this album means and what the message of the album is. And I like that they put that at the end of the song, at the end of the album, instead of just giving it to you straight out the gate with, the first track. Overall, the songs are about life and purpose. They're relatable to kind of a young adult audience, especially because I think a lot of young adults, which are I'm just assuming, they say you shouldn't assume things, but I'm just assuming that the age of the band members when they were writing this album are kind of the age that this would relate to the most, kind of your maybe college age, early to mid 20s, sometimes even early 30s. That's kind of your bracket of this young adult demographic, which I guess a lot of people would say 30s is not young adult, but, culture, that kind of culturally, people may still have that mentality in their 30s, even though they're technically, between 20 and 40, they're halfway there. So, but I think this kind of young adult, just anybody that's still trying to find their way in the world, they're struggling, trying to find their purpose in life and, maybe a career or, what they want to do or, a vision that they have for their future. I think that a lot of people in current day and age, like Western culture, a lot of that is in kind of the decade of your 20s, but I think even into your 30s as well for people that are, I think it's relatable for all ages, but I think that in general is kind of your demographic, if you will. But that's kind of a blanket statement. But I think overall, the album as a whole is kind of talking about these really relatable thoughts and struggles of just being human and trying to find our way in the world. Overall, I think the flow is really good. It has really good cohesion as all of the songs kind of encompass that as kind of your general theme, which I think honestly is really rare to find in an album where all of the songs feel like they fit the same theme or message of the album. However, kind of like I mentioned, I think some of the tracks do feel pretty redundant. Sometimes musically, I think Rest and Trust are a bit redundant musically, and I'm sure this is going to be a really controversial opinion, but I think even the song Arrow and Runaway, lyrically and conceptually, are really redundant. They're both pretty much saying the same thing. Arrow is saying the hardest place to be is right where you are, and Runaway is saying, like, basically, I've been trying, I'm not happy with where I'm at in life right now, and, but, there is hope, like, I don't need to run away. So in general, I think that there's a lot of pairs of songs that really are, in so many words, saying the same thing just in different ways, and I think that allows for a lot of consistency, but then I think there are also some redundancies kind of doubling up the same message in multiple songs. So that was kind of the biggest reason I couldn't give it full points. But another reason I couldn't give it full points is I think you kind of already touched on Breakfast and how that works as a track, and I agree. I just don't think if it is doing what kind of you mentioned, and I hadn't thought about it before, but kind of recapping the entirety of the album, I think that's a great concept, but I do think it failed in execution. Another thing I don't like, I think this track Notion, and again, I know I'm bringing this up again, but I think it really jars your momentum of the album. I think that, and I feel like it also just doesn't fit. I think you could argue that it's this interlude track, and the concept I really do think fits the band's kind of overall worldview, and it fits the concept of the album, but it's a really odd segue. It doesn't lead you into the following song. It doesn't recap what you just listened to. It's just this odd, no music voice memo track of somebody that's not even in the band talking, and then it leads you into the next song. And the next song doesn't even have anything to do with what the voice memo was about. compare that to, and I know it's not always fair to compare things, but compare that to on Owl City's album All Things Bright and Beautiful, the track I wrote it down, sorry, my handwriting's really tiny, January 28th, 1986.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very much, it has musical backing, it has, a voice recording, and then it segues right into the track Galaxies. It's two separate tracks, and it's a track that doesn't seem to fit, but it segues perfectly into the next song. It's setting you up for...
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with the musicality behind it, and that's just unfortunately missing from The Notion. I think if they had so The Notion falls between...
Is it right before Runaway?
No, it's after Maybe and before Still Feel. So I think what could have helped is just either you extend the musicality of the ending of Maybe into The Notion, or you drag out the intro, which Still Feel doesn't really have an intro. It literally has a chord and then it goes. Yeah. So maybe that would have been the best way to do it, is to drag out the musicality of Maybe.
But I don't think it still doesn't fit.
True. I agree.
Maybe it would have flowed a little better, sure. But I think it still doesn't fit. It doesn't
I agree.
Summarize what we talked about in Maybe, and it doesn't launch us into Still Feel. It's just this really weird moment where we're cruising along, and then all of a sudden there's a traffic cone in the middle of the road and we've got to swerve around it or come to a screeching halt. And I feel like it kind of pulls the album to a screeching halt. And I hate to knock on a 30-second track of an album, but also I really don't see the point. I think that everything that's said in The Notion, I think it's adds value in giving you a better picture of who the band is and where they're coming from. But again, the voice memo is not even from somebody who's in the band. I've heard albums before where there may be vocal interludes in between tracks, maybe interspersed, but it's at least the band member talking, or maybe it's somebody that's, maybe the voice memo could have explained the title, or something, but it really doesn't feel like it ties in anywhere, except the fact that same individual has a voice memo that's 10 words max at the very end of Creature.
Which I think in that case, it fits better than The Notion does.
Right. I feel like they could have come up with a more creative way to fit that voice memo into the overall flow of the album, and I think it really does the album a detriment. That, I'm sure this is going to sound bad, but I'm sure there are a ton of people that make a playlist of this album and just don't even add that track because it messes up the whole flow of your listening experience. So some pros, some cons, so half a point out of 1.
Okay. For album flow and cohesion, do you want to guess what
half a point out of 1.
I also did half a point out of 1. So like I mentioned before, I think Half Alive has a very specific kind of sound. And I think, like you said, overall, this album has a really nice cohesion and flow. I do agree that it kind of becomes a little stale sometimes, a little samey. Like I mentioned earlier in production, if you're looking for a super varied album where it's we go from a jazz track to a ballad to a country folk vibe, you're not going to get that.
Anybody picks up an album from a single artist expecting that.
Maybe not.
That's what you have a compilation
sure
or of various artists.
Sure. But I think that for the most part, you're not going to get anything crazy. But everything sounds from track to track like it belongs, with the exception of the two things that you mentioned. The Notion, which basically makes you feel like you were on a roller coaster and then you shoved it into emergency park and then they were actually everything's cool, and then they shoot you off again, and it just feels jarring, and it doesn't necessarily detract from what was before or behind, but it leaves you a little confused in the middle. And then Breakfast, which is kind of I don't really know what's going on here. It feels like, you know, when you watch like a TV show, and they do this a lot with like dramas, like any sort of dramatic or like hour-long show, and it's like you start the next episode and they'll have like a 3 to 5 minute recap. That's kind of what Breakfast feels like. And this is why Netflix has a skip recap button, because I think it just feels like we've already done this before. So I don't love that.
I thought you were going to say it's like in a drama when something's happening to the main character and you're like, what the heck is going on? Who the heck? And then they're like, and it was a dream.
No. I just mean like when they do like a episode recap.
I thought that's what you were going to say, because it's kind of like waking up from a nightmare.
One thing I do really like, though, that I want to talk about is how I think a lot of the tracks, I think this is primarily found in Still Feel, but I think it can apply to a lot of other songs. I like the fact that Half Alive, as a general rule, has music that kind of sounds like it's not necessarily pinned to like a certain decade style. I think that like there are some elements, especially in Still Feel, but I think it happens in other tracks too, but I kind of just want to use that as my example, where it's like I mentioned earlier, it kind of gives almost like a 70s vibe in a way, but then they're still using like synthesizers and like modern musical techniques to achieve the sound. And I think it's just kind of like a nice mix up that almost kind of makes it feel timeless in a way. And I'm sure this is probably not an opinion that everybody who's a fan of Half Alive would agree with me, and that's okay. Music is constantly changing, and I think that a lot of modern artists do pull from inspirations in decades past, so things always kind of come back into style or trend eventually. And I'm not trying to say that I think Half Alive like looked at the 70s and was like, this is the trend we want to emulate or something like that. I don't necessarily think that. I just think that the way that they kind of marry like the new musical techniques and like resources that they have, along with these almost like classic or familiar, I don't even know how I want to describe this, but like musical notations that you would find a lot in like music of decades past. I like that they kind of join those things. And I think they do a really good job with it. And so I think that because of that sort of like timeless feel that's present in a lot of the album, I think it kind of fits the cover art, which I know we don't often talk about the cover art, but the cover art is basically like an orange, and then there's like what looks to be a big moon in the background of this orange landscape, and then there's a man and woman dancing, but they have no like head, and the way I'm describing it sounds like it could be like grotesque, but it's actually not, I don't think.
It kind of, the stylization of it kind of looks like almost like two people that are kind of cut out of a magazine.
Yeah,
like it's like a still image. It's not
right.
Like they look like
photographs
of people moving. It almost looks like,
yeah. And the way that they're dressed and the way that they're dancing, it almost gives like a 50s 60s vibe, mm-hmm. where it like the man is like in a suit and the woman is in like a polka dot dress, kind of looks very reminiscent of like the 50s maybe, and they're dancing what appears to be something like a shag or sock hop or something along those lines. And I think that it just sort of adds to this sort of like not specifically tied to like one sort of decade aesthetic or another. It kind of is like this frozen in time kind of feel, and I like that. So I think there's some like really interesting things that they did for that, and then I don't want to rehash the things we've already talked about, but definitely room for improvement as far as flow and cohesion goes. So 0.5 point out of 1 for me.
Alrighty, so our next category, second to last category, as always, is personal taste and preference. And out of a total possible score of 2, I gave this 1.5 points out of 2. Overall, I enjoy this album. I do find it refreshing for a lot of the reasons you kind of just mentioned about how it's just musically, it's a nice blend of kind of modern and kind of classic music, if you will, like classic rock-esque. music. It's definitely an album I've listened to multiple times, and it's one of those albums I can listen to on repeat. But because I find there to be a bit of redundancy, I do kind of get fatigued listening to it constantly, like listening to just this album by itself on repeat. Although I've done it before, but I can't do it for very long and I have to put it away for a while. I do think it does have the appeal of being lyrically layered, so that gives it good, like, re-listening appeal, I guess would be the best way to put it. But overall, I think it's the kind of album that really works best if you mix it into a playlist of other stuff. It does sound very consistent when you hear the song come on, you know, oh, that's Half Alive. But I think that it is a pretty short album, and it's not one that I can listen to on repeat because, 2 of the 12 tracks I typically don't like to listen to, meaning, The Notion and Breakfast. I typically skip those. So I could listen to it on repeat maybe like 2 or 3 times, and I'm like, all right, I'm done. I'm ready to move on to something else, just because it does sound very similar to itself. So 1.5 points out of 2.
Okay. For me, for personal taste and preference, I gave this a full 2 points. I did obviously have critiques, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm not necessarily gauging those in regards to talking about this, but I think overall,
that's the whole point. You don't have to.
Right. I think overall, I'm content skipping the songs that I don't care for and thoroughly enjoying and immersing myself in the ones that I do. I stumbled into this band while I was kind of searching for new music to freshen up my playlists a few years back. I was really kind of just bored with the same, I felt like I'd been listening to the same stuff for years, and I probably had been a decade at that point. So I just kind of been trying to branch out my musical tastes around this time. And an internet friend of mine posted the music video to Still Feel, and I was like, I really like this song. Another internet friend chimed in and said, hey, I really like this band. I've been listening to them for a year now. I think their album is really great. So I gave their album a listen. And I think at that point I was kind of like, this is freshening. This feels fresh in the way that I want something like this. I've been looking for something like this and didn't know it, I guess, at the time. It's got this 70s acoustic electronic dancey mashup thing that I really struggle to explain or put into words, but it scratches this musical itch. And it is something that I'm not listening to it every day, but I'm listening to it multiple times a week. I am mixing most of these tracks into playlists that I play at work, in the car. Half Alive has now become a band that is present always, in my musical palette, repertoire. I don't know what to say, but I think I've really, really come to appreciate Half Alive. I consider myself a fan of their music now and of the band. It feels in a weird way cozy and new at the same time. And as long as I don't overplay it, I think it continues to feel that way for me, and I really enjoy that. Plus, getting to see them live, and I remember getting really emotional at the end of their concert because I thought they were finished and they hadn't played Creature, and I was like, oh, okay, well, that's fine. And then they started Creature as their final number, and I remember getting really emotional and having an actual I just felt, I don't know. I'm anybody who's been to a concert of a band that you really like, or that plays a song that really, you feel you've got it kind of tucked into your heart. I think you've probably experienced something like this or something similar, but that's just a moment I'll never forget. And so listening to this album, and specifically, of course, the track Creature, kind of just brings me back to that moment for a minute. And I just revel in that memory a little bit, and I think it's just a really nice memory that I'll hang on to for a really long time. And so while I don't necessarily think they're a perfect band or that this is a perfect album, I think for what it is and for the horizons it's broadened in my musical taste and understanding, I really, really like it. And I couldn't find it in me to really critique it in any way for this category. So that's why I'm going with full points, 2 out of 2 for personal taste.
Some of my favorite songs of Half Alive are not even on this album, so.
Oh, okay.
All right.
That's fair. I have other favorites from other albums of theirs too, so.
Yeah. All right, last category is creativity. Always, in every category, it's a total possible score of 1. I give this full points for creativity. A lot of what you've kind of mentioned about how it's this like mashup of different genres and stuff, I attributed to this category specifically. I feel like this album and the band overall, I feel like it doesn't particularly fit in any of the genres of modern mainstream music. It really feels like a throwback to a more timeless sounding musical era, kind of like you've mentioned. For it to have gained the popularity and acclaim as a quote-unquote indie band, I think is pretty impressive. It definitely fits kind of a criteria of this category that we have, which is if something is really new or unpredictable. And I think especially since some of its themes and the themes of the band are pretty overtly Christian worldviews, I think for this band to have gained such positive notoriety at its debut album, and for individuals to take this band seriously and not immediately pigeonhole them into like a Christian genre, I don't think this band fits the genre.
I was gonna say, I would not classify this album as like a worship album. It's not.
Even like contemporary Christian
right.
music, I wouldn't put it in that kind of category. So for it to have been recognized as kind of a modern, like, I think Wikipedia might classify it as a pop album. I don't think that's completely accurate. But to me, the music of like the 60s, 70s, and 80s that was considered pop music, like the Beatles were considered pop music in their era.
Right.
I feel like if this album would fit that era's category of pop. It's not that hard rock of like, some of the 70s and 80s bands that more heavier, what now would not be considered heavy metal at all, but at its time was.
Yeah.
It's not the same rock genre as like the band Kiss.
Right.
So it wouldn't have fit that album. And I feel like if this band came out in, 60s, 70s, 80s, it would have been considered pop. So I don't necessarily think it's wrong to call it that. I would say they're more of an indie band because I don't think they fit the genre. But I think that it absolutely, in this day and age with this generation, this kind of music, I'm sure it's out there, so don't at me. Like, I'm sure it's out there and you just have to know where to look. But for it, though, that kind of music is clearly not making mainstream impact the way that this album has. It received a lot of critical acclaim when it came out. They were, highlighted in different publications. It charted really well on Billboard for a band that's not, super well known or they're not collaborating with, they didn't have a single with Ed Sheeran or Justin Bieber or, Taylor Swift to like catapult them to the chart. They really did it on really their own merit and their sound as a whole. So I think all of those reasons are exactly why we have this category. And I think especially the sound in and of itself and the complexity of the lyrics, the way it's just really, really well written. And then, of course, the fact that it's not been pigeonholed into any one genre and they haven't been, completely dismissed because they're willing to kind of wear their worldview on their sleeve. I think all of those reasons merit credit for creativity as an album as a whole. For the band too, but this is their debut album, so this is what kind of put them on the map. So that's why I gave it full points for creativity.
Okay. For creativity, I also gave it full 1 point. I think that, kind of like what you said, I think Half Alive and this album came out in 2019, which is a time that I was feeling really fatigued by like pop music in general. And I say that as like a lover of pop music. Like, I would say probably the majority of what I listen to could be classified as pop. I'm not in any way like hating on the genre, but I fully admit it can get really tiresome, and especially like things that are on like the top 40, they all sound the same, and it gets a little bit like, okay, another whatever song by the same 4 people that have been on the top 40 for the last year. Like, it just kind of felt like I was just wanting something different. And I think that this album came out kind of at a time where in general it was it was just coming out amid like stale music, I think. I'm sorry for anybody who their favorite song ever came out in 2019. Like, I'm sorry. But I'm just saying that, like, I think that Half Alive appeared on the music scene in a way that was like, it just feel really refreshing. I think that it's a new, not new, but like fresh repackaging of like of sounds that feel good and sound nice and you know, make you want to re-listen and go again and pair it with other songs and artists. I think that the cool thing about Half Alive is that they are different enough to be distinct, but they are not so different that if you put it into a playlist with other like indie bands or artists, that it would sound like unnatural or like it didn't go. And so I think that they really did do a great job at kind of marrying new creativity with like old, comfortable, like familiar, cozy kind of feelings. And I just think that they do that so well. Another thing I want to talk about in the creativity category, and I know this is something that I put way more merit typically into than Holland does, is music videos. So when I was prepping for this album, I did go to Half Alive's YouTube. They have a playlist that they've created a playlist for each of their albums, and they put things in chronological order. And if there is a music video that's created for that song, then it's there. And if there's not, then it's just the official audio video.
So I will tell you, I was going to do that to prep for this album, except I'm a peasant and I have YouTube with ads.
Oh.
I can tell you how irritating it was.
I understand.
The first song finished, then I have to watch
an ad
reels.
Yeah.
And then to hear it. So it really messed up my ability to like review the album.
Yeah.
So I did that and I had to quit.
Okay. That's valid. I'm bougie and I pay for YouTube Premium, so I don't have that problem.
Well, now that we're on YouTube, you can, you know, we can make you mad.
Yeah.
If we have ads on our videos.
Yeah.
We probably don't at this point.
So that being said, their music videos are often kind of odd. They do a lot of dance that I would consider to be like contemporary, borderline art, like kind of artsy, and I don't care for it a lot. I don't think it's necessarily bad, but I do like the elements of their music videos that tend to be more story driven, which are present in some of their music videos. Like the music video for Runaway and Arrow are a little bit more story focused, whereas like Still Feel is very like choreography based, and it's not bad and by any means. I wouldn't say I dislike any of it, but I think that their aesthetic for their music videos does also kind of set them apart because it is distinct. And when you watch a Half Alive video, when you become familiar with their videos and they release another one, you're like, okay, this is a Half Alive video. Like, it feels like that. But thankfully, they're different enough that it doesn't feel like you're watching the same video over and over. So I just wanted to kind of mention that because I feel like I like music videos a lot. And I know I've mentioned that in other album episodes that we have done, but I put a lot of merit into like the visual representation of a song, or if there's a performance or choreography, like that all means something to me. So I take those things into account. So while I don't necessarily think that they're like the best music videos of all time, I do think they're worth a watch. And I think they're very distinctly creative and distinctly Half Alive in their feel and overall aesthetic, and they always do match the song that they're presenting very well. So 1 out of 1 for me for creativity.
Yeah, and if you're new to our show, if you're first time listening, because now you can watch us, we don't have any like strict rule of thumb for the two of us on whether or not we let music videos impact our score, because we talked about this when we were coming up with this category and how we wanted to be able to score things. Because like for me, I don't particularly feel the need to allow a music video to affect my score, but like for Tori, it's really important to her, and that gives her a lot of impact. And so we kind of have left it open to each other's our own interpretation of whether or not that should be whether you can give that credit or not. Because at the end of the day, it's either the artist or the label that has used this other piece of media as a piece of their creative work to further present their album to the individual and the audience. So I just wanted to mention that as a kind of a recap if you're new to our show, because we leave it kind of open. Tori typically uses that to impact her score, and usually she talks about it in creativity, but I may watch music videos, but I just personally let the album stand on its own. And so there's no right or wrong. It's just how we both approach things differently. So I just wanted to mention that. So.
Okay.
Final scores?
My final score is 7.5 out of 10.
Mine is 7 out of 10.
All right.
I can do some math.
Okay. So lightning round?
Yeah. Did you have any final thoughts?
No, I don't. Do you?
Okay, no.
Okay. Lightning round questions. Here we go. All right. Favorite track?
That's a tough one. Because listening through this album again, I feel like my opinion has kind of changed a little bit.
There's a track list if you need it.
Oh, nice. Thank you. Yeah, I think it probably is still... my favorite track has pretty consistently been Runaway. And so I think I would probably continue to say that's my favorite track.
Okay.
I have some that kind of like...
It's funny you didn't talk about Runaway a lot.
I did not.
But that's okay. But...
No. But I like it. I like that one.
You said you have some that like...
They kind of like swap places.
What are other like high contenders for you?
High contenders, probably Still Feel for sure. I do enjoy Creature a lot. And probably Okay.
Okay.
Those would probably be like my top 4. But then sometimes I'll like get in the mood and I'll be like, maybe it's just really hitting it today.
Yeah, yeah, I get it.
Depends, so.
Mine was Creature for a while, and then switched to Arrow, and now it's Arrow. But I also find myself, I do like Rest a lot. I listen to that one quite often.
Nice.
So, okay, next lightning round question. Least favorite track? Breakfast.
I dislike Breakfast even more than I dislike The Notion, as much as I've like dunked on it this whole podcast.
Yeah.
At least The Notion is over really quick.
Yeah, I agree. Breakfast, for all reasons we've already stated. Okay, this is a question that has to do with the fact that we've seen them live.
Okay.
Were there any of their songs from this album that you noticed were significantly different live, or you liked less or more live?
That's a good question. I don't remember what their whole set list was, because the ones that really stuck out to me are the songs that are not on this.
Okay, that's fair.
I think overall, just the in general, like if you've never seen Half Alive live, kind of a good picture would be if you watch some of the music videos, because they're very like artsy in the like with choreography and stuff on stage, just the way they were in some of the music videos. Mm-hmm. So I feel like some of the songs that really had this very like contemporary dance style choreography were probably the ones that I was like, oh, okay. That's not really my thing, but I thought it was just interesting. But I honestly, off the top of my head, can't recall which songs off of this album had that.
Yeah.
That was really prominent. So, no, I just can't remember.
That's okay.
So,
I remember Runaway being really, really fun at the concert. And I think they, if I remember right, I think they looped some of the drums in the beginning and then like came in.
I feel like they did. Was it for Runaway?
I think it was Runaway. I don't remember super clearly, but I think it was Runaway. Because you know how like Runaway starts with like the shaker and the tambourine? I feel like they changed the intro of that a little bit and they started some drum, like some percussion. I don't want to say drum, but like some percussion, and then they like looped it on like a loop pad.
Right. I kind of remember that.
Yeah, and I remember thinking that was really fun.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. What track would you delete from the album?
So, as much as I don't like Breakfast, I feel like I would delete Rest from the album. Yeah.
That is not what I thought you were going to say.
I just think it's super redundant.
I like it. I like that
song. I think it's super redundant. I feel like Trust or Rest. I would delete one of those because I just feel like they're both. You could literally sing one on top of the other. That's my hot take. You could literally sing whatever, like trust is like a bog of murky water. Rest is the season. I mean, literally, it's like the same song. So I would delete one of them.
I would delete The Notion.
I mean, yeah, I would delete that too, but I feel like it's even more egregious that two of your songs are so similar.
No, I don't think so. I like those songs.
Well, that would be my hot take. If I was Simon Cowell, producer, I would be that brutally honest, and that's what I would pick.
Okay, so this next question...
Yeah, it would probably be Rest. I would delete Rest. Yeah.
I'm hurt.
And then I'm sorry, Sam, but I don't particularly think he adds a whole lot to that song.
I like it.
But again, I didn't really cover that in my review because I feel like that's my personal taste and not quite as objective.
That's fair. That lightning round questions are pretty subjective, so. Okay, next question. How does this album compare for you to some of Half Alive's other music? Since we're pretty familiar with their discography as a whole.
I haven't actually listened to their newest album a whole lot.
Okay.
So I can't really speak to that because life happened and I just...
That's fair.
Yeah, not really in the mood. I don't know. I'm actually a really big fan of their EP. Their first, the 3 tracks on that.
I love their original EP.
I really, really enjoy that music, and I think all of those songs are really consistent.
Mm-hmm.
You know, some artists will release music as an EP, and then they will include those songs on their debut album. I feel like they should have done that, because all 3 of those songs, I feel like, would have fit this album pretty tonally. Maybe
it's
not.
The Fall, Awake at Night, and Tiptoes, right?
I feel like all 3 of those would have been nice variety to this album, because they don't feel quite as similar. And then one of the songs I really like is Time To, and I think that would have fit this album as well. But it was released as a single,
yeah.
In Summerland. I really like Summerland.
So
like those songs, I actually feel like most of those songs, which are newer, the majority of those I enjoy just as much, if not more, than a lot of the songs on this album.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think overall the sound is really consistent. And then like their newest, what was it, Give Me Your Shoulders?
Yeah.
Was their second album. Was that their second album?
That was like the collection of singles that they released prior to the album that they were included on, which was Conditions of a Punk, something like that.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that their sound is really consistent. So as far as like, are you looking for something specific as to like how I think that...
Just like, is it, if you were to say like, you know, this is the weakest, I think, in their opinion, or I think it's the strongest overall in their opinion.
I think they're just very consistent as a band. I think it's definitely a Hallmark album for them.
Okay.
But yeah, no, I think overall their sound, I think, is pretty consistent.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same. I think that this album in general, again, I also really love their EP. So if I were to go by like albums that have like the percentage of songs that I think are just like killer, then their EP would probably be like the top for me, but it's only 3 songs. And I think their singles, like you mentioned, that came out between this album and their next ones are all really like consistently good too. On their Conditions, or I think it's Conditions of a Punk album, there's only like 2 songs that I like really, really always come back to. And then their newest single, which is called Subliminal, I really, really love. I've been listening to that one a lot.
I think that's why I haven't really listened to that album. If that album includes all of the like Give Me Your Shoulders tracks,
it does. I believe so.
Once I started listening to it, I was like, oh, I've already heard all these songs.
Yeah. I think it's kind of like what they did for this album, but I just wasn't super familiar with their music until after this album had been released. So I think if I had been around since like their first EP, it probably would have been like a similar thing where they had released like singles from it, and then here's the album as a whole. Gotcha. So yeah, but I think kind of like you said, I think that like if somebody were to be like, I want to know about Half Alive, where should I start? This would be the album that I would tell them to start with, just because I think that even though it's not perfect, I think it is kind of like the best photograph of like who they are in their sound and style. So I think, like you said, it's kind of like the good hallmark. It's a good highlight album. But not to say that any of their music outside of this is any worse or better, but yeah. Okay, last lightning round question. If you could have another artist cover a song from this album, what artist and song would you pick? We've done questions like this before, but it's been a while.
Oh, that's a tough one. This is probably like a really cop-out answer. But the first thing that came to mind would be to have Paramore cover Still Feel.
Ooh.
So I feel like they as a band would cover it really well. But I feel like it's really easy because we've reviewed Paramore and Owl City. I feel like
well, they're artists that we love, so I don't think it's
I feel like
bad.
My brain always goes to
Paramore
and Owl City as like covering songs. So I'm trying to think of something different. But go ahead. Do you have an answer?
I was actually going to say Paramore as well, and I was going to say Paramore for Runaway. I think that could be really fun. But yeah, I can come up with something else too.
Yeah. I'm trying to just give a little bit of variety in like my answers. Who would you want to cover? Because we asked that question a lot, and we're always like Paramore, Owl City, which is not a bad thing. But that's just like who we listen to.
Yeah.
Together. I'm trying to think of somebody like super, not like off the wall as in like crazy, but like something that's just really, ooh. You know what would be really cool to hear do Still Feel? What if Michael Jackson did?
Oh, that would be...
Wouldn't that be really interesting?
That would be really interesting. I think it would... Like, the bones would stay the same, but I think the color of the song would be completely different. Yeah. And, like, all of the ad-libs at the end would be, like, Michael ad-libs. That would be...
Yeah.
Let me try to think of a classic artist.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a off-the-wall answer.
Okay.
What if Fleetwood Mac did Ice Cold?
I was just thinking Fleetwood Mac doing Arrow.
That would also be cool. But I was thinking, like, Ice Cold because there's both the male and female vocalists, and Fleetwood Mac did that in a lot of their songs. Yeah. So
that would be a good one.
Wouldn't that be cool? Mm-hmm. Okay, we did some good answers.
I think you could also do... I feel like we did also review Chicago album, and Chicago's really horn heavy. I feel like you could do Chicago, could cover Maybe.
Ooh, that would be cool.
It doesn't have as much like soul of a through line of it, but maybe they could just like put their own kind of spin on it.
Yeah. All right, anything else?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us on this episode. Hope you had a good time. If you did not, feel free to tell us why. We can't get any better without feedback, so let us know. Show notes, Patreon, socials, suggestion box, that's all located at our website. That's lionandmousepodcast.com. You can also review this episode on whatever podcast platform you are using or prefer. Let us know what you think. YouTube comments are also welcome. Thank you so much for listening. As always, we'll catch you in the next one.